Right, then the speech, of course, focusing very heavily on trade issues. Both he and his host here in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, both focusing very strongly on the issue of trade. We are essentially, they warned, moving away from the existing multilateral system into an environment in which unilateralism is pretty much the status quo. They did warn that this begar thy neighbor policy will essentially be to the disadvantage of everyone involved. What was interesting, though, was the proposals that he put forward. China will expand its imports. That was extremely important, especially for a lot of African countries that do export a lot of raw commodities, as it were, towards the Chinese market. The question, of course, is what sort of specific measures are they going to see in that respect? Are we looking at an increase in quotas? Are we looking at a reduction in tariffs? Those are the finer details that we'll certainly be looking forward to. But this, of course, was a speech that very much focused on trade issues. At no point was the United States or the US President Donald Trump mentioned by name, but very much the emphasis here is that, look, we need to be more open, we need more trade, we need more investment, and this whole begar thy neighbor approach to economic policy simply doesn't work, and it's not in the interest of any of the economies around the world.
And the president did mention the trade war and its impact on global economies. So, Rama, I also want to get your thoughts on the fact that President Xi mentioned the BRICS Africa cooperation and how that needs to be boosted. Why is that so important to the continent?
Well, if you look at trade patterns for a lot of African economies, that really is the answer. If you look at South Africa, for instance, a lot of its trade is essentially with the southern end of the continent. It's literally the anchor of the Southern African development community. If South Africa, to put it in very simple terms, if South Africa gets a cold, the rest of the region gets a very nasty bout of pneumonia. You look at places like Kenya, for example, India and China are pretty much right in the top 2, top 3 sources of its imports. A lot of the refined fuel consumed in Kenya comes directly from refineries in India. If there's a problem with the Indian economy, if there's a slowdown in the Chinese economy, it directly affects these two economies on the African continent. Flip it from the other perspective. If you're a supplier of commodities, right, into, say, India or China, and you get affected by this trade war business, and if you look at the prices of iron ore and copper right now, they're all down by about 10 to 16%. That basically means your revenues essentially have fallen by a comparable margin. So it is extremely important that the trade links between China, India and the African continent as a whole are pretty strong. But in the long run, there is a recognition here that this trade relationship will not essentially grow if you have one side just shipping off commodities one end and then buying finished goods from the other. That has to change, which is why this speech is here focused so strongly on the need to essentially develop more skills across the continent. And one of the interesting things that, of course, came out in President Xi's speech was when he mentioned that, look, yes, we know there are a lot of technological changes coming through with things like machine learning, a lot more automation coming into the market across a broad range of sectors. These transitions will be painful, he says, but they do represent a significant opportunity. Governments also need to invest in the industries that will essentially be hardest hit by these changes in tech to essentially make that transition, especially for the labor side of it, to make that transition a lot easier and more productive for everyone in general.